Hello YouTube, this is Russ Strock. I wanted to continue making my videos on this series of topics which involves beekeeping, sort of an introduction and dealing with some of the setbacks. I've talked a little bit about the solar panels in a subsequent video, and that is really kind of how to get started and break through some of the key actions I took. And in this video, I want to talk a little bit about my adventures in winemaking. And again, many of these topics I think are hobbies or activities that many folks think about doing, but for whatever reason don't actually start. We call this channel SSS for keeping things simple, sustainable, and done in a suburban setting. So let me jump right into the winemaking adventures. I started this process of making my homemade wines 7 or 8 years ago, and again had some pretty mixed success at the beginning, but a couple things that I realized is that oftentimes the local fruit that you have growing on your property, or if you have access to it from neighbors or at a local market, when it's really in season, when it's abundant and cheap or even free, is often the best. I have mulberry trees that grow around this area, and I have several on my just 2.5 acres here in Southeast Michigan. And for many years, we owned this property. We never really used the mulberries for domestic use. The wildlife love them, the birds, the turkeys, the wild turkeys, the deer, they all love the mulberries, and the birds flock into them. But I began to explore online the possibility of making mulberry wine a few years ago, and I can't tell you what an enormous hit the mulberry wine has been with friends and with family and myself. It is truly one of the best wines I have ever had, and yet I've never been able to buy it in a supermarket. I don't think it's grown commercially and sold commercially. My fiance and I, especially her, we made up these labels which we put on some of our bottles when we make the mulberry wine, and it just kind of adds a nice touch to the whole winemaking process. We call it Strock Estates because my last name is Strock, and we have sort of these are upside down. We have sort of a label for each one. So this is Strock Mulberry. This label here on the bottle is Strock Estates Strock Cherry. So we sometimes blend our mulberries with other berries like cherry. So what I'm going to do is just kind of describe to you a little bit of the equipment that you need to get started. It's really not expensive. It's pretty basic. It's not that complicated, and it's really rewarding. I like to make my wine in a 5-gallon batch, roughly a 5-gallon batch. And anything smaller isn't enough. Anything more tends to be, quite a bit more work. But just some of the basic gear you'll need is you'll need a couple of these food grade barrels, different sizes. This happens to be it's a 5-gallon bucket here, but there's probably another gallon here. This is probably a 6-gallon bucket. A fine mesh bag to strain the fruit. A carboy. This is a 6-gallon plastic carboy. You can get them in glass too, but a couple of these. You'll need a hydrometer. This is one of the tools of the trade. This will measure the specific gravity of your mixture. When you put the berries with the sugar and some other additives, you need to make sure that the density of your liquid, your mash, I'll call it, it has a certain specific gravity, and all of this I can lay out a little bit later. But this is a little glass device that floats and sinks depending really how much sugar is in your, it's measuring sugar content, how much sugar is in your mix. And through the sugar content, you can easily calculate an estimate of your alcohol by volume. So for the winemaking, again, I said it's really a pretty simple process. It just takes a little bit of time for the steps to sort of take place. And so you have to be a little bit patient, but from start to finish, after about 3 weeks, you'll have your first glass, your first bottle of homemade wine. If you don't have access to mulberries, you can use other fruit. I often pick up items from Costco. This is Montmorency cherry juice, just pure cherry juice. You don't want a bunch of additives, stuff that might inhibit fermentation. But in grape juice, many grape juices have additives that prevent fermentation, but this one does not. So this cherry juice is great stuff to make wine from, or to mix it with fruit to make a cherry blend. I've got the bees, I have honey, so occasionally I'll make a cherry infused mead using honey from the bees. But anyway, the top wine that I've made, and I probably have made, I don't know, 50 different kinds of batches and blends over the years, maybe more than that. The top hit has been mulberry wine and mulberry blended wine, especially mulberry cherry wine using that cherry juice that I just showed you. There are several websites that are quite good and offer, sort of free winemaking information. The one that I like the best is called Homebrew It. And Homebrew It offers a recipe, many winemaking recipes, and one of them is for mulberry wine, but they have recipes on there for almost every major fruit that you can imagine. Here's a blackberry wine recipe, again from the Homebrew It website. I follow the recipes pretty closely and multiply by basically 5 or 6, depending if I'm making 5 gallons or 6 gallons. Most of these recipes are designed for 1 gallon. And just by way of background, again, for the different types of wine that I've made, blackberry, mulberry, mead, it takes about, let's separate the mead, but for the berry wines, it takes about 25 to 30 pounds of fruit to make 5 to 6 gallons of wine. Again, 25 to 30 pounds of fruit to make about 5 or 6 gallons of wine. To that 25 or 30 pounds of fruit, depending on which kind of fruit it is, you want to add around 15 pounds of sugar. And the way that you know if you've got the right amount of sugar is to use the hydrometer. The hydrometer, once you mix the sugar with the fruit and a certain amount of water, and it's so key not to add too much water to start out with and get your reading, because if you add too much water, it's hard to correct the hydrometer reading. Now, the hydrometer reading that you want to start with depends on whether you like dry wine, medium sweet wine, or sweet wine. And once again, online, there's what's called a triple scale beer and wine hydrometer chart. And I know you can't entirely see this on the screen here, but I use this chart and I target the range for a medium to sweet wine. I prefer a dry wine. Everybody I know prefers a dry wine, but the medium to sweet wine hydrometer reading, the specific gravity reading, produces the kind of wine that I seem to like the best, as well as all of my friends and family. Honestly, we can't get enough of the mulberry wine and the mulberry blended wine. I also blend the mulberry wine with the blackberries, and I have a nice blackberry patch, a thornless blackberry patch that I have in the backyard. So I keep records of all the batches that I've made, and a notebook here with the specific readings when I start, the beginning specific gravity when I start, the ending specific gravity. So when I subtract those two numbers and multiply it by a factor, I can determine exactly what the alcohol is by volume. And that specific number, you just 1.034 is the multiplier. But when you do the math, you can figure out your final alcohol by volume. And interestingly, much of my wine ends up being 15% alcohol by volume or a little bit higher. It's very high. Now, one of the modifications that I have used on the recipe that I mentioned earlier from Homebrew It is I like to use two types of yeast in each of my my vats of wine. I like to use something called 71B, and I like to use Montrachet Premier Classic. So I mix the two and I put them in there at the same time. And instead of using water in the fruit recipes, oftentimes it's about 5 or 6 quarts for your 25 to 30 pounds of fruit and your 15 pounds of sugar. You'll add 5 or 6 quarts of water. I like to add the cherry juice. The cherry juice is a little bit more expensive, but I think it enhances the flavor. But this is something you have to experiment with, and you're really targeting that specific gravity at the start on whether you want sweet, dry, or medium sweet wine. Again, there's some other additives you put in to the mix, but to get started, if you have your fresh berries, you'll put Camden tablets in there, which is basically a sulfur tablet. It's 1 tablet for every gallon of mix. So here you'd put six tablets in for 6 gallons, or 5 tablets for 5 gallons. You got to mix that, crush it up, mix it, let it sit overnight. So that tablet will effectively kill all of the native yeast that might be on your fruit. After about 24 hours, you can start adding all the ingredients and actually start your winemaking process. One of the things I like to do after I add the sugar to the mulberries in my case, or blackberries. By the way, I don't like a straight blackberry wine made from the blackberries here. I have not figured out a recipe that truly makes that a desirable table wine unless it's mixed. But one of the things I like to use is my high-tech 2x4, and you can see it stained here on the bottom. That's purple from the mulberries, and this is how I crush the berries. I just put it in this bucket, and twice a day in the morning, I just go around like this. I break up that cap. There's a cap that floats on the top. After a couple of days, you mix it in and you mash it. The fermentation process kind of breaks down the skins, and it all seems to work out pretty well. Usually, after you add the yeast, within about 24 hours, plus or minus, you'll start to see some bubbling, and that means primary fermentation is underway. And it'll actively ferment for 3 or 4 days. You want to keep it, I keep it in my basement here at about 65 degrees or so. It'll ferment for 4 to 7 days, somewhere in that range. A nice, consistent, relatively slower fermentation, I think, is better than a fast, high temperature fermentation. After the fermentation is pretty much over, you'll take this bucket of must, it's called, the whole mixture, your sugar, your juice or water, your berries, you'll pour it through this filter to get all the fruit out, all the seeds out, and you'll pour it into another food grade bucket, a bigger 6 or 7 gallon bucket. Once it's in there, you can then put it in a carboy, a 6 gallon or so carboy, use a funnel and pour the liquid into here. Use a stopper and a CO2 lock. I should have brought those with me. And let that sit. That's considered secondary fermentation. Once you remove the fruit, filter it, let it sit there. You can taste it, but probably in another week to 10 days, you can start pouring some of that homemade wine into a glass and sampling it. I don't use any Camden tablets or any preservatives. I just store it as is, and it's really, really, really good for about 6 months. So I try not to make any more than I can consume or give away, in a half a year or so. So with that, I can share more information online. I just don't know how much interest there is in online on YouTube for this kind of material and information. I've had a lot of success also making rhubarb wine. My rhubarb comes out almost clear or with a slightly yellow tint. It's not red or pink. I've made strawberry rhubarb wine. I have mixed the rhubarb with other fruits. The rhubarb wine has a very different taste, but it's good. It tends to come out a lot drier, but I suppose I could add more sugar. I also have some peach trees. I have made peach infused mead wine. So the mead I mentioned earlier is basically wine made from honey, from the bees. And the peach infused mead turned out quite well. Mead is just a little bit more tricky to make, but it's fun. So if you're a fan of homemade wine, if you would like more information on that I've covered in this video, I am happy to share it. I just tried to keep this simple. I try to keep it focused on what you can do in a suburban neighborhood. And again, mostly I try to do activities here that are quite sustainable, using honey here from the property, using the mulberry trees that are also on the property, and keeping the cost relatively low. So with that, I'll wrap up and say thank you, and I'll look forward to any comments or feedback that you have.